Grant signed the paperwork in a ranger station that smelled like old coffee and pine cleaner, his hand still shaking slightly as he scrawled his name across a liability waiver, and the district supervisor barely looked up from his computer as he slid a laminated map across the desk and said the tower was 40 miles north, last 12 on a fire road that turned to mud when it rained, and supplies came every 2 weeks if the weather held. The supervisor was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a gray beard and eyes that seemed tired of seeing seasonal workers come and go, and he told Grant the job was simple: watch for smoke, record weather data 3 times daily, radio in at 0800 and 1800, keep the logbook current, and if he got lonely he could quit any time. Grant nodded and said he wouldn't get lonely, and the supervisor pushed a cardboard box across the desk, canned goods, batteries, a new logbook with a green cover, and a laminated sheet of radio protocols, and told him the previous lookout had left 2 days ago and the tower had been empty since. The drive north took 3 hours on paved roads that narrowed and cracked as he climbed into the mountains, then another hour on the fire road, his truck bouncing through ruts while Douglas firs pressed close on both sides, and the canopy turned the afternoon into permanent twilight. He'd left his apartment in Portland with nothing but clothes and books, left the divorce papers signed on the kitchen counter, left his phone turned off in the glove compartment because he didn't want messages from his ex-wife or her lawyer or anyone who knew the man he'd been 6 months ago. And when the tower finally appeared through a gap in the trees, a skeletal structure of rust-red steel rising 120 feet above the ridge, with a small glass-walled cabin perched on top like a watchful eye, he felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in months. The stairs were a narrow metal skeleton spiraling up the outside of the tower. Each step graded so you could see through the ground below, and Grant climbed slowly with his duffel over one shoulder, pausing twice to catch his breath and look out over the endless carpet of green stretching to horizon, unmarked by roads or towns or any sign of human presence except the tower itself. The cabin at the top was maybe 12 feet square, windows on all 4 sides with narrow catwalk running around outside, and inside was just the essentials: a cot with thin mattress, a wooden desk facing north, a propane stove and mini fridge, a battery-powered radio mounted on the wall, shelves stacked with weather instruments and topographic maps, and binoculars on a hook beside the door. It smelled like dust and old wood and something faintly sour that might have been sweat or fear. But Grant dropped his bag on the cot and went to the windows and looked out his kingdom of trees and felt, for the first time since the marriage fell apart, like he might actually be able to breathe again. The first few days fell into an easy rhythm that felt almost meditative in its simplicity. He woke with the sun, made coffee on the propane stove, recorded temperature and humidity and wind speed in the logbook with mechanical precision, then spent the morning scanning the forest with binoculars, looking for the telltale smudge of smoke that never appeared. Lunch was canned soup or beans eaten cold from the can. Afternoons were reading or napping or watching hawks circle below the tower, and twice a day he radioed headquarters with his report, speaking to a bored-sounding dispatcher named Carol, who acknowledged his transmissions with minimal commentary and never asked how he was doing. The sunsets were spectacular, the sky turning shades of orange and purple and red that seemed impossible, and Grant would sit on the catwalk with his legs dangling to the railing and watch the light die across the mountains and feel the day's heat bleeding away into the cool evening air. He slept deeply those first nights, exhausted by the altitude and the manual labor of hauling water and supplies up the stairs, and his dreams were mercifully empty, free of the arguments and accusations and bitter silences that had haunted his sleep for months. By the 4th day, he'd almost convinced himself that he could stay here forever, that the tower could be a place where his old life couldn't reach him, where he could sand down the rough edges of his grief and rebuild himself into someone simpler and cleaner and whole. That night, he made dinner, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, and ate while reading a paperback western he'd found on the shelf, something from the 70s with a lurid cover and prose as dry as the desert described. And he was halfway through chapter 3 when he heard it, At first, he thought it was wind or an animal or maybe a branch scraping against the tower's steel frame. But then it came again, and there was no mistaking for anything natural. A man's voice, distant and faint but unmistakably human, rising up from the darkness below and crying, "Help! Please, somebody help me." The words were ragged and desperate, stretched thin by exhaustion or pain, and Grant dropped the book and went to the window and pressed his face against the glass, trying to see down into the forest. But the floodlight mounted on the catwalk only illuminated a narrow circle of trees directly below, and beyond that was just impenetrable black. He grabbed his flashlight from the desk, a heavy mag light that the previous lookout had left behind, and to open the door and stepped onto the catwalk, sweeping the beam down into the darkness while the voice kept calling, over and over, "Help me, please, I'm hurt. Somebody help me." And the desperation, it made Grant's heart hammer against his ribs, because this was real. This was someone in actual trouble, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost or injured, and he had to do something. He didn't think. Didn't pause to consider the strangeness of hearing a voice this far from any trail. Didn't wonder why someone would be hiking in complete darkness. He just moved, slamming back into the cabin to grab the radio and key the mic and report, "Headquarters. This is Tower 17. I have someone calling for help near my position, requesting immediate assistance." But the radio crackle was static, and Carol's voice came back flat and mechanical. "Copy that. Tower 17. Acknowledged." And nothing more. Grant waited for follow-up questions, for her to ask about the person's location or condition or how many people might be involved. But the radio stayed silent, and the voice from below kept crying for help, and Grant made a decision. He clipped the radio to his belt, grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink, and descended the tower stairs 2 at a time, his boots ringing against metal as the flashlight beam bounced crazily ahead of him, and his breath came hard and fast in the cold night air. At the bottom, he hit the ground running, crashing through the underbrush toward where the voice seemed to be coming from, maybe 100 yards east of the tower base, and he shouted, "I'm coming. Stay where you are. I'm coming to help you." His light swept across tree trunks and ferns and fallen logs, catching the green reflection of animal eyes and sending small creatures scattering. And he kept calling out and listening for a response, following the sound of that desperate pleading voice that seemed to stay always just ahead of him, just out of reach. He searched for what felt like hours, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold, his hands scratched and bleeding from pushing through blackberry brambles, and gradually, he almost didn't notice it happening. The voice faded away until there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the faint rustle of wind in the high branches. Grant stopped in a small clearing, turning in a slow circle with his light cutting geometric patterns through the darkness, and realized he had no idea which direction the tower was, or how far he'd come, or what he'd actually been chasing. The silence was absolute, heavier and more complete than any silence he'd experienced, as if the forest itself was holding its breath and waiting to see what he would do next. He tried calling out again, "Hello? Can you hear me? Where are you?" But his voice sounded small and foolish and swallowed by the trees. And when no answer came, he felt the first cold tendril of real fear working its way up his spine. He forced himself to think, to be rational, to remember his training. He found the North Star through a gap in the canopy, oriented himself, and started walking west until he saw the tower's faint red aircraft warning light blinking in the distance. The climb back up the stairs felt twice as long as the descent, his legs shaking with exhaustion. And when he finally stumbled back into the cabin, he went straight to the radio and keyed the mic with trembling hands. "Headquarters, Tower 17. I searched the area and found no one, no signs of anyone. But I definitely heard someone calling for help. They sounded injured. We need to organize a proper search at first light." The silence stretched for so long, he thought maybe the radio had died. But then Carol's voice came back, still flat, still utterly devoid of concern or curiosity. "Copy that. Tower 17. Acknowledged." Grant stared at the radio, waiting for more, waiting for her to say something human. something that acknowledged the strangeness of the situation. But she said nothing else, and eventually he hung the mic back on its hook and stood in the middle of the cabin, still breathing hard, still covered in scratches and dirt, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. He looked at his watch. It was nearly 4 a.m, which meant he'd been down there for almost 3 hours, and he had nothing to show for it except torn clothes and a growing certainty that something about this night had been deeply, fundamentally wrong. He didn't sleep after that, just sat at the desk watching the skies slowly lighten from black to gray to pale blue, and when the sun finally rose and lit the forest below in shades of gold and green, Grant picked up binoculars and scanned every inch of the terrain he'd covered during the night, looking for any sign of disturbance. But the forest looked exactly as it always did, pristine, untouched, and utterly empty. He made coffee with hands that still trembled, the propane stove hissing in the quiet cabin, and tried to rationalize what he'd experienced, tried to convince himself that sound did strange things in the mountains, that the voice had probably come from farther away than he'd thought, maybe from a trail on the other side of the ridge. But even as he constructed these explanations, he knew they didn't account for the way the voice had seemed to move, always staying just ahead of him, or the unnatural silence that had fallen the moment he'd stopped chasing it, or the complete lack of interest from headquarters. He sipped his coffee and thought about his ex-wife, about how she used to accuse him of overthinking everything, of seeing patterns where none existed. And he wondered if maybe the isolation was already getting to him after just 4 days. But then he looked out at the endless forest, at the mountains stacked like purple shadows on the horizon, and he knew he wasn't ready to leave, wasn't ready to go back to the world of lawyers and paperwork and the apartment where everything reminded him of what he'd lost. So he opened the green logbook to a fresh page and recorded the date, the weather conditions, in a single sentence. Heard calls for help approximately 2 o'clock. Searched perimeter. Found no evidence of distressed party. He closed the book and told himself that would be the end of it. That tonight would be different. That whatever he'd heard was a one-time occurrence he'd never have to think about again. Grant spent the day trying to convince himself that the previous night had been an anomaly, some acoustic trick of the mountain wind, or maybe even a vivid dream brought on by exhaustion and altitude, and he threw himself into his duties with obsessive intensity, recording temperature readings every hour instead of every 3, cleaning the already spotless windows until they squeaked, organizing the supply shelves, anything to keep his mind occupied. He radioed headquarters at the scheduled time and gave his report in a flat, professional tone, mentioning nothing about the night before, and Carol acknowledged with her usual bored efficiency before signing off, leaving him alone again with nothing but the wind and the endless green silence. Lunch was tuna from a kin that he ate without tasting, and afterward he sat on the catwalk with the binoculars, scanning the forest methodically, looking for he didn't know what, movement, smoke, some sign that another human being existed within 100 miles, but seeing only trees and more trees, their branches swaying in the afternoon breeze. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness, and Grant found himself checking his watch every few minutes, and as the light began to fade and shadows pool between the trees, he felt his heart rate climbing, his palms growing damp, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly because this was ridiculous. He was a grown man getting worked up over nothing. He made dinner as the sun set, heating up a can of chili on the propane stove, but when he sat down to eat, he found he had no appetite, his stomach tight with dread he couldn't name or shake. So he scraped the food into trash and made coffee instead, strong and bitter, and sat at the desk with his paperback Western open in front of him, pretending to read while his eyes kept flicking to his watch, watching the minutes creep toward 2 a.m. When midnight passed, he told himself he could relax, that if something was going to happen, it would have happened by now. But then 1 o'clock came and went, and he was still sitting rigid in his chair, the book forgotten, his coffee gone cold in the cup, and when his watch showed 1:58, he stood up and went to the window and looked down into the darkness and waited. At exactly 2 o'clock, the voice came again, rising up from the forest like it had been waiting there all day, patient and hungry. "Help! Please, somebody help me." The words were identical to the night before, the same desperate pleading tone, the same ragged quality like the speaker was injured or exhausted, and Grant felt ice slide down his spine. Because this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. This was something deliberate and wrong. He grabbed the flashlight in his radio and was halfway to the door before he stopped himself, his hand on the knob, his whole body screaming at him to run down there and help. Because that was what you did when someone was calling for help. That was the most basic human imperative. But another part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through a deployment in Afghanistan and a decade of wildland firefighting, was telling him that something about the situation violated every natural law he understood. He stood frozen in the doorway, caught between instinct and reason, while the voice continued to call from below. And then he made a decision. He would search, but he would do it smart. He would be methodical and careful, and he would pay attention to every detail. And if anything felt wrong, he would retreat immediately. He descended the stairs quickly but quietly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And when he reached the ground, he stopped and listened, pinpointing the direction of the voice. East again, same as last night, maybe 100 yards into the trees. He pulled out his knife and scored a mark on a tree at the tower base to mark his starting point, then began moving toward the sound, stopping every 20 feet to score another tree, leaving himself a trail to follow back. The voice kept calling, steady and rhythmic, and Grant pushed through the underbrush toward it, his light sweeping side to side, and he called out, "I'm coming. Where are you? Keep talking." But the voice didn't acknowledge him, didn't change its pattern, just kept repeating the same words over and over like a recording. He moved deeper into the forest, marking trees as he went, and the voice seemed to stay always at the same distance ahead of him, never getting closer no matter how fast he walked. And that was when Grant started paying attention to other things, details his panicked mind had missed the night before. The forest was completely silent except for the voice. No insects, no animals, no wind in the branches, just dead air and that desperate calling. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since he'd left the cabin, his breath coming out in visible clouds even though it was June. And the trees themselves seemed wrong somehow, their trunks too straight, their branches all angled in the same direction, as if they were leaning away from something. Grant stopped walking and stood very still, his light aimed at the ground, and noticed that there were no footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anyone had passed this way recently or ever. He turned slowly in a circle, counting the marked trees he'd scored, 12 of them, which meant he'd come about 240 feet from the tower, and the voice was still calling from somewhere ahead, still the same distance away. And that was impossible because he'd been walking toward it for 10 minutes. He made another mark on the tree beside him, a double slash this time, and then started walking again. But now he was watching the voice's behavior, testing it, and within 30 seconds he confirmed what his instincts were screaming. The voice was moving, pacing him, staying exactly far enough ahead to keep him following. Grant stopped again and called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" And for the first time the voice changed. It stopped mid-word, the forest plunging into absolute silence, and Grant stood there in the darkness with his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand, waiting, and then the voice came again but from a different direction, from his left now, circling around him. "Help me, please. I'm hurt. Somebody help." He spun toward it, bringing the light up and saw nothing but trees and shadows, and then the voice came from behind him, then from his right, moving around him in a circle, and Grant realized with sick certainty that he was being herded, being moved away from the tower, and he needed to get back right now. He turned and started following his marked trees back the way he'd come, walking fast, ignoring the voice that now seemed to come from multiple directions at once, overlapping and echoing. And when he reached the double-slash tree, he should have been able to see the tower's lights through the forest, but he couldn't. There was only darkness in every direction. Grant broke into a run, his light bouncing wildly as he crashed through brush and jumped over logs, following the marked trees, counting them backward, 11, 10, 9, and the voice was following him now, keeping pace, no longer calling for help but making sounds that were almost words, almost human, but stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. He burst out of the tree line at the tower base, gasping for air, his legs shaking, and looked back to see nothing but darkness and trees, the forest silent again, and he climbed the stairs 3 at a time, not stopping until he was back in the cabin with the door locked and bolted behind him. His radio crackled to life, and he nearly jumped out of the skin before grabbing it with trembling hands and keying the mic. "Headquarters, Tower 17. I have an active situation here. Something is very wrong. I need immediate extraction." There was a long silence, long enough that Grant thought maybe the radio was dead. And then Carol's voice came through, but it sounded different somehow, flatter and more mechanical than before. "Copy that. Tower 17. Please describe the situation." Grant took a breath and tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent. There's something in the forest, something calling for help, but it's not human. It moves, it circles, it tried to... "Tower 17, Carol interrupted, her voice now completely devoid of inflection. "Have you observed any smoke or fire activity in your sector?" Grant stared at the radio in disbelief. "No, I'm telling you there's something out there. Something dangerous. I need to leave this tower now." Another pause and... "Copy that, Tower 17. Acknowledged. Continue normal operations. Headquarters out." The radio clicked off and Grant stood there holding it, his mind reeling, because that had been a normal response. That had been a dismissal, and he suddenly understood with terrible clarity that headquarters knew. They'd always known, and whatever was happening here was expected, maybe even sanctioned, and he was on his own. He set the radio down carefully and went to a window and looked out at the forest, and in the distance, barely visible in the starlight, he could see something standing at the tree line, a dark shape that might have been a person, perfectly still, and as Grant watched it raise what might have been an arm and pointed up at the cabin. And then it was gone, melted back into the shadows, and Grant knew without question that it would be back tomorrow night, and the night after that, and he had no idea how to make it stop. He spent the rest of the night sitting at the desk with every light in the cabin blazing, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. And when dawn finally broke and pale light began filtering through the trees, he felt a relief so profound it made him dizzy. He made coffee with shaking hands and forced himself to drink it, then sat down with the green logbook and tried to write an entry that would make sense. But how did you describe what he'd experienced without sounding insane? He settled on 2 o'clock, heard distress calls again, investigated with caution, observed anomalous acoustic behavior and unnatural environmental conditions, returned to tower, requested extraction from HQ, request denied. The words seemed inadequate, capturing nothing of the terror or wrongness of what he'd encountered. He closed the book and looked around the cabin, really looked at it for the first time, and started noticing things he'd missed. Scratch marks on the wooden window frames, faint but deliberate, like someone had been trying to claw their way in, and water stains on the ceiling that formed patterns that almost looked like words, and a smell he'd attributed to previous occupants, but that now seemed more like decay, like something had died in the walls. Grant opened the desk drawers one by one, searching for anything that might help him understand what was happening. In the bottom drawer, underneath old weather charts, he found a stack of incident reports dating back years. He spread them out on the desk and read through them with growing horror. Reports of lookouts hearing voices at night, of shapes moving in the forest, of electronic equipment malfunctioning, of sudden illnesses and psychological breaks, and every single report had been marked investigated, and further action required in red ink. One report from 3 years ago described a lookout who became convinced something was stalking the tower and had barricaded himself inside for a week before being evacuated. And the investigator's note said, "Subject displayed signs of acute anxiety and paranoid ideation consistent with isolation-induced psychosis." Grant laughed bitterly because that was the pattern. Anyone who reported what was really happening got labeled as crazy and reassigned. And the tower stayed operational, and new lookouts kept coming, kept hearing the voice, kept going down into the forest, and some came back and some didn't, and headquarters just kept sending more. Grant didn't go down on the 3rd night. couldn't bring himself to descend those stairs again no matter how loudly the voice called, and instead he stood at the window with his hands pressed against the glass, watching the darkness below and feeling like a coward, like he was failing some fundamental test of his humanity by not responding to someone in distress. But he kept thinking about the way the voice had circled him, herded him, the unnatural silence and the impossible distance that never closed, and he knew that whatever was down there wasn't someone he could save. The voice came at 2 o'clock as expected, and it sounded angrier this time, more insistent. The words coming faster and overlapping like multiple recordings playing at once. And Grant stood there and listened and did nothing, and eventually the voice faded away and left him alone with his guilt and his fear. He couldn't sleep, couldn't even sit still. So he paced the small cabin like a caged animal, and as the hours crept toward dawn, he found himself staring at the shelves, at the decades of logbooks stacked there collecting dust. And he realized that if this had been happening for as long as the incident report suggested, then those logbooks might contain evidence, patterns, some clue about what he was dealing with. He pulled down the oldest one he could find, a leather-bound book from 1952, and carried it to the desk where the first gray light of morning was just starting to seep through the windows. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting old-fashioned and precise, and the entries started normally, weather observations, smoke reports, supply inventories. The lookout's name was Thomas Brennan, and for the first 3 weeks a logbook read, like a nature journal, peaceful and unremarkable. Then, on day 23, Grant found the first mention, heard strange sounds from forest at approximately 2 o'clock hours. Investigated but found nothing. The next entry, 2 days later. Sounds again at 2 o'clock. Seems to be a voice calling. Will search more thoroughly. And then the entries came faster, the handwriting getting messy. The voice is definitely human. Someone is lost out there. I've searched every night for a week. Radioed HQ multiple times. They tell me to continue normal operations. Found old logbooks in storage. Davies, 1949. Heard it too. So did Peterson, 1947. Why didn't anyone tell me? The entries became increasingly frantic, describing exactly what Grant had experienced. The voice that moved, the unnatural silence, the way it seemed to know when he was coming. Brennan had tried everything, but nothing worked, and the voice kept calling night after night. Then, about 6 weeks in, the tone changed. I saw it today, just for a moment, at the tree line. It looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long. The voice is getting closer to the tower. Last night, it was almost at the base of the stairs. It knows my name. It's calling Thomas, now instead of just calling for help. I tried to leave today, walk down the stairs, but when I reached the bottom, I couldn't make myself go into the forest. I'm trapped. The final entries were barely legible. It's not trying to lure me down anymore. It's trying to get up. I hear on the stairs at night, climbing, but when I look, there's nothing there. I understand now. The tower isn't a lookout station. It's a cage. Something is trapped here, and it needs someone to let it out. It needs permission. It needs to be invited in. I won't let it in. I won't. And then, in handwriting that looked different, looser, almost euphoric. It's calling my name now. And the rest was blank, and Grant noticed the handwriting of that final entry looked nothing like Brennan's careful script. It was someone else's writing or something else's attempt, and he wondered what happened to Thomas Brennan, whether he'd ever left the tower or he was still here in some sense. Grant set that logbook aside with trembling hands and pulled down another, this one from 1967, and found the same pattern. Normal entries followed by increasing distress, followed by that final line about the voice calling the lookout's name, always in different handwriting, always followed by blank pages. He went through several more spanning different decades and found the same thing every time, like reading the same story over and over, and he realized every single person who'd stayed in this tower long enough had experienced exactly what he was experiencing. But then he found something different, a logbook from 1998, and the name inside was Sarah Chun, the same name from the journal he'd found. Her logbook entries matched her journal almost word for word, describing the voice, the searches, the growing sense of wrongness. But her entries continued past the point where most lookouts ended. She'd stayed 7 weeks, longer than almost anyone, and her later entries reveal why. I've been studying it, trying to understand what it is. It's not random. The voice always comes at 2 a.m. This is behavioral, predatory. It's hunting. I think I know what it wants. It wants you to accept that it's real, that the voice calling for help is genuine. And once you truly believe that, once you give yourself over to the need to help it, then it has you. I've stopped going down. I'm trying to starve of attention. Maybe if I ignore it long enough, it will give up. But her final entry suggested that strategy hadn't worked. It's changed tactics. It calls using voices of people I know. Last night, it was my mother's voice. It's in my head somehow, pulling out memories, using them against me. I see it clearly during the day. It stands at the base wearing different faces. People I've lost. It looks like my father now, and I know it's not real, but I want to go down there. I want to believe it's really him. And in the final entry, I see him clearly now. He's at the base of the stairs. He looks like he's been waiting a very long time. I think I'm supposed to let him in. Grant closed a logbook and sat in the growing daylight, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd read. The pattern was clear. The thing in the forest, whatever it was, had been here for decades at least, probably longer, and it was intelligent, adaptive, learning from each encounter how to better manipulate its victims. It started with generic calls for help, moved to using names, then graduated to impersonating loved ones, always escalating until the lookout either broke and went down to it or went mad from the psychological pressure. And headquarters knew, had always known, because how could they not when every lookout reported the same experience, when the logbooks documented it in excruciating detail, when people disappeared or returned broken and traumatized. This wasn't a fire lookout station. It was something else, and Grant had volunteered to be the latest in a long line of people fed to whatever was waiting in the forest below. He stood and went to the window, looking out at the peaceful vista of green trees and blue sky, trying to reconcile with the nightmare that unfolded in darkness. And he thought about running, about climbing down and walking away and never looking back. But Sarah Chen's entry about not being able to enter the forest stuck with him, and he had a horrible suspicion that if he tried to leave now, he'd find the same thing, that some invisible barrier would stop him at the tree line, because the thing down there wasn't done with him yet. He needed more information, needed to understand what he was dealing with. So he spent the rest of the day going through every logbook, reading faster now, looking for patterns and exceptions, looking for anyone who'd escaped or survived or beaten this thing. Most stories ended the same way. The lookout either stopped writing abruptly after that final, "It's calling my name now" entry, or they kept writing for a few more days in increasingly distorted handwriting before the entries devolved into nonsense. But he found 3 exceptions. 3 lookouts who completed their full assignments and left entries describing their last days without madness or disappearance. The first was Robert Hayes from 1973, who'd lasted 4 months by apparently never acknowledging the voice at all. His entries mentioned hearing atmospheric anomalies at night, but treated them as natural phenomena, documented them scientifically without emotional response, and never once used the word voice or help. Hayes had approached the whole experience like a researcher studying a weather pattern, detached and analytical, and he walked away at the end with nothing more than a note. Phenomena continues to manifest nightly. Recommend future lookouts be briefed on psychological effects of prolonged isolation. The second was Patricia Okonkwo from 1986, who'd lasted 3 months by treating the voice as explicitly hostile from the start. Her entries describe building defenses, salt lines at the door and windows, religious symbols carved in the furniture, and a rigid routine that never varied and never included going outside after dark. She'd written, "Whatever calls from below is not human and has never been human. It does not deserve compassion or response. It is a predator and must be treated as such." Her final entry was almost defiant. "Contract complete. Leaving tomorrow." It did not win. The third was David Park from 2019, who kept a separate notebook alongside his official logbook, and Grant found this notebook stuck behind the others. Its pages filled with sketches and diagrams and theories. Park had been an anthropology student taking the lookout job for thesis research, and he'd approached the voice as a folklore phenomenon, documenting everything methodically and comparing entities from Native American mythology and regional legends. His notes suggested he believed the voice was something called a walker, a category of entity that existed in the liminal space between human and spirit, that fed on acknowledgement and attention, and needed permission to cross certain thresholds. Park had written, "The tower acts as a boundary. The entity cannot cross it without invitation." Previous lookouts who disappeared likely granted that invitation, consciously or not. Survival depends on maintaining the boundary, never granting permission, never acknowledging it as real. Park's final entry, dated at the end of his 4-month assignment, read, "Theory confirmed. Maintained strict boundary protocols throughout assignment. Entity grew more aggressive in final weeks but could not breach tower. Leaving with all research intact. Recommend tower be decommissioned and sealed." But the tower hadn't been decommissioned, Grant thought bitterly, because here he was 5 years later, and headquarters was still sending people up here without warning, and he wondered how many had died or gone missing in the years between Park's departure and his arrival. He looked at his watch, past noon, which meant he'd been awake for more than 30 hours, and exhaustion was making his thoughts fuzzy, but he couldn't afford to sleep, not until he had a plan. He made more coffee, hands shaking from caffeine and adrenaline, and spread out the 3 successful logbooks on the desk, studying them for commonalities. What Hayes, Okonkwo, and Park had in common was that they'd all refused to engage with the voice on its terms. They'd either ignore it completely, treated it as an enemy, or studied it as a specimen, but none had done what Grant had done. None had run down into a forest trying to help. None had given the thing what it wanted. Grant had already failed that test, had already acknowledged the voice as real and responded to it, had already given it his attention and his fear, and he wondered if that meant he was already compromised, already on the path that had claimed so many others. He thought about Sarah Chun, about how she tried to withdraw her acknowledgement after giving it, and how that had failed, how the entity had simply changed its approach and wore her down until she'd broken. Grant needed a different strategy, something none of the previous lookouts had tried, because he had an advantage they hadn't. He'd read their stories, learned from their mistakes, understood the pattern, and if he could figure out the entity's limitations and exploit them, maybe he could find a way to break the cycle instead of just surviving it. Grant closed Sarah Chen's logbook and sat in the growing daylight, his mind racing through the implications, and he realized he needed to talk to someone. Needed to reach out beyond this tower and find someone who might understand what was happening. He remembered there were other fire lookout towers scattered throughout the district, some within radio range, and he pulled out the communication protocol sheet and found a list of tower call signs and frequencies. He waited until mid-morning, when most lookouts would be monitoring their radios, then switched to the shared frequency and keyed the mic, his voice casual. "This is Tower 17 calling any stations in range. Just checking in, wondering if anyone's got ears on." The radio crackle was static for a moment. Then a woman's voice came through. "Tower 17, this is Tower 9. I copy you. What's your situation?" Grant hesitated, trying to figure out how to phrase his question without sounding insane. "Tower 9, just settling in. This is my first week. Wondering if you got any advice for a newcomer. Things they don't put in the manual." There was a pause, and when the woman spoke again, her tone had changed, become more guarded. Tower 17. Best advice is keep your head down. Do your job. Don't borrow trouble. Tower 9 out. The radio clicked off before Grant could respond, and he switched frequencies and tried again. Any stations in range. This is Tower 17, looking to connect with other lookouts, trade stories. This time a man's voice responded, older and weathered. Tower 17, this is Tower 23. Been doing this job for 15 years. What do you want to know? Grant felt a spark of hope. Tower 23, I'm curious about the history of these towers. Wonder if you'd heard any interesting stories from the old-timers. Another pause, longer this time, and finally, Tower 17, you asking about the voices? Grant's heart jumped. Tower 23, affirmative. I've been experiencing some unusual acoustic phenomena at night. The man's voice came back flat and final. Tower 17, listen to me carefully. Don't go down after dark. Don't respond to it. And for God's sake, don't let it learn your name. That's all I'm going to say. Tower 23 out. The radio went dead, and Grant tried to call back, but got no response. Grant slumped in his chair, exhausted and scared, because that brief exchange had confirmed what he'd suspected. Other lookouts knew about it, and the universal response was to keep quiet and survive. He made a decision then. Fueled by exhaustion and anger, he would search the cabin more thoroughly, find every scrap of information previous lookouts had left behind, and piece together enough evidence to force headquarters to shut this tower down permanently. He started with the obvious places and worked systematically through the small cabin, and in a metal box on the floorboards near the stove, he found something that made his blood run cold. The box contained personal effects left behind by previous lookouts: a woman's watch, a man's wedding ring, eyeglasses, an old cell phone, a wallet with a driver's license showing a young man named David Park, the anthropology student who'd survived, except apparently he hadn't taken all his belongings. Grant opened the wallet and found cash, credit cards, Park student ID, everything a person would need. And he couldn't imagine Park leaving voluntarily without these things. Grant dug deeper into the box, finding more items, and at the very bottom, a stack of Polaroid photographs held together with a rubber band. He spread the photos out on the desk, and his skin crawled because they all showed the same thing: the view from the tower looking down at the base of the stairs, and each photo, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing there looking up at the camera. The photos were dated on the back, spanning from 1987 to 2003, different handwriting on each one, and Grant realized that multiple lookouts over the years had tried to document what they were seeing, had tried to capture proof of the entity's existence, and they'd all seen the same thing: a dark shape at the base of the tower, always watching, always waiting. He picked up the most recent photo, dated 2003, and held it close to his face, try and make out details of the figure, and his breath caught because unlike the earlier photos where the figure was just a blur of shadows, in this one the figure was clear enough to see features: a pale oval face tilted upward, dark holes where eyes should be, and a mouth stretched too wide in what might have been a smile or a scream. Grant dropped the photo like it had burned him and backed away from the desk, his heart hammering, and he looked out the window at the forest below, at the base of the stairs where the photos had been taken, and saw nothing. But that didn't mean nothing was there, just that it wasn't showing itself in daylight. He forced himself to calm down and think rationally. The photos were evidence, proof that this thing was real and had been documented over decades, and if he could find more evidence, build a case, maybe to convince someone in authority to take action. He went back to searching and found a loose panel in the wall behind the filing cabinet, and when he pried it open with his pocket knife, he discovered a narrow space between the walls that had been used as a hiding spot, and inside was another journal, this one recent. The pages still crisp and white. The journal belonged to someone named Michael Torres, and the first entry was dated just 6 months ago. Grant's hand shook as he read because Torres had been on the lookout immediately before him. the one the supervisor had said left 2 days before Grant arrived, and Torres's entry started optimistic and eager. He'd taken a job to save money for graduate school, planned to spend his free time studying and enjoying the solitude. But within a week the tone had shifted dramatically. Torres had heard the voice on his 5th night and had made the same mistake Grant had made, running down to help, searching for hours, finding nothing, and his subsequent entries documented the same pattern of escalation Grant had experienced. The voice returning nightly, growing more insistent, learning his name, beginning to appear at the tree line during the day. But Torres had also done something Grant hadn't thought of. He tried to research the tower's location, using satellite internet to look up the history of the site, and he discovered something disturbing. Before the tower was built in 1947, the ridge had been the location of a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, one of those isolated facilities where people were sent to die in the early 1900s. And the sanatorium had burned down in 1923 with 37 patients trapped inside because the fire had started at night, and the facility had been locked from the outside to prevent patients from wandering. Torres had written, 37 people died here, burned alive or suffocated, screaming for help that never came. The tower was built on top of their graves. No wonder this place feels wrong. No wonder something is still calling. The final entries in Torres's journal were dated just 2 weeks ago, and they were nearly illegible, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls. It doesn't just use voices anymore. It shows me things. I see people burning. I smell smoke. I hear screaming from inside the walls. I know it's not real, but I can't make it stop. I try to leave 3 times. I can't. Something won't let me pass the tree line. I'm trapped here. It's wearing my face now. I saw it today. It's standing at the base of the stairs, and it looks exactly like me, and it's calling my name in my own voice, and I don't know which one else is real anymore. And then the last entry, dated the day before Grant arrived. I understand now. The tower doesn't trap the thing below. The thing below is already free. The tower traps us. We're not lookouts. We're food. We're anchors. We're the next voices calling from the dark. I'm going to end this before it takes me. I'm going down. Grant closed the journal and sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling, because Torres hadn't left, hadn't quit, hadn't been reassigned. He'd gone down to the entity knowing what would happen, choosing that over whatever alternative he thought was worse. And 2 days later, headquarters had sent Grant up here as a replacement, had sent him into the same trap, without warning or explanation. And he realized with horrible clarity that they knew, they'd always known, and they kept the tower operational anyway, because whatever was trapped here needed regular feeding, needed someone present to sustain it, and if the tower ever sat empty for too long, something worse might happen, something that would spread beyond this ridge and into the wider world. He stood up and paced the small cabin, his exhaustion forgotten in a surge of adrenaline and anger, and he thought about all the lookouts who'd come before him, all the people who'd sat in the same chair and read these same logbooks and realized the same terrible truth, and he wondered how many of them had fought back, how many had just given up, how many had walked down those stairs into the darkness because they couldn't see any other way out. Grant went to a window and looked out at the peaceful forest, at the morning sun filtering through the trees, and he tried to imagine what Torres had felt in those final moments, whether he'd been afraid or relieved or so far gone that he'd actually believed the thing at the base of the stairs was really him, really offered some kind of escape. The radio crackled to life suddenly, making Grant jump, and Carol's bored voice came through. Tower 17, this is headquarters requesting your morning status report. Grant grabbed the mic and keyed it, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Headquarters, Tower 17, I want to know about Michael Torres. The lookout who was here before me. What happened to him? Where did he go? There was a long silence, and when Carol responded, her voice had that same flat, mechanical quality he'd heard before. Tower 17, personnel information is confidential. Please provide your weather observations." Grant slammed his hand on the desk and shouted into the mic, "I found his journal. I know he didn't leave. I know what's down there. You've been sending people up here to die, and I want to know why." Another silence, longer this time, and then a different voice came through the radio, male and older and cold as ice. "Tower 17, this is District Supervisor Edmonds. You need to calm down. The isolation can cause paranoid ideation, and we're prepared to evacuate you if necessary. But I need you to acknowledge that you understand you're experiencing psychological distress related to your recent divorce and the stress of the job." Grant stared at the radio in disbelief because they were going to gaslight him. We're going to pretend his observations were symptoms of mental illness. And he realized that's what they'd done to every lookout who tried to report what was happening, labeled them crazy, evacuated them, and sent someone new who didn't know any better. He took a breath and forced his voice to sound calm and professional. "Headquarters, I understand. I apologize for the outburst. Probably just need more sleep. Weather is clear. Temperature 72 degrees. Wind from the northwest at 5 miles per hour. No smoke observed." The supervisor's voice came back, slightly warmer. "Copy that, Tower 17. Get some rest. We'll check in again this evening. Headquarters out." The radio clicked off and Grant sat there shaking, knowing he just bought himself a temporary reprieve, but that they were watching him now, listening to every transmission, waiting for him to crack, so they could justify pulling him out and replacing him with the next victim. Grant spread the photographs out on the desk, and his skin crawled, because they all showed the same thing. The view from the tower, looking down at the base of the stairs, and in each photo, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing there looking up. The photos were dated on the back, spanning from 1987 to 2003. Different handwriting on each one, and Grant realized that multiple lookouts over the years had tried to document what they were seeing, had tried to capture proof of the entity's existence, and they'd all seen the same thing, a dark shape at the base of the tower, always watching, always waiting. He picked up the most recent photo, dated 2003, and held it close to his face, trying to make out details of the figure. And his breath caught because unlike the earlier photos where the figure was just a blur of shadows, in this one the figure was clear enough to see features, a pale oval face tilted upward, dark holes where eyes should be, and a mouth stretched too wide in what might have been a smile or a scream. Grant dropped the photo and backed away from the desk, his heart hammering, and he looked out the window at the base of the stairs where the photos had been taken and saw nothing. But that didn't mean nothing was there. He forced himself to calm down and think rationally. The photos were evidence, proof that this thing was real and had been documented over decades. And if he could find more evidence, build a case, maybe he could convince someone to take action. He went back to searching and found a loose panel in the wall behind the filing cabinet. And when he pried it open with his pocket knife, he discovered a narrow space that had been used as a hiding spot, and inside was another journal, recent, the pages still crisp and white. The journal belonged to someone named Michael Torres, and the first entry was dated just 6 months ago. Grant's hand shook as he read because Torres had been the lookout immediately before him, the one the supervisor had said left 2 days before Grant arrived, and Torres's entry started optimistic. He'd taken the job to save money for graduate school, planned to spend his free time studying. But within a week the tone had shifted dramatically. Torres had heard the voice on his 5th night and had made the same mistake Grant had made, running down to help, searching for hours, finding nothing, and his subsequent entries documented the same pattern of escalation, the voice returning nightly, growing more insistent, learning his name, beginning to appear at the tree line during the day. But Torres had also done something Grant hadn't thought of. He'd tried to research the tower's location, using satellite internet to look up the history of the site, and he discovered something disturbing. Before the tower was built in 1947, the ridge had been the location of a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, one of those isolated facilities where people were sent to die in the early 1900s And the sanatorium had burned down in 1923 with 37 patients trapped inside because the fire had started at night and the facility had been locked from the outside to prevent patients from wandering. Torres had written, 37 people died here, burned alive or suffocated, screaming for help that never came. The tower was built on top of their graves. No wonder this place feels wrong. No wonder something is still calling. The final entries in Torres's journal were dated just 2 weeks ago, and they were nearly illegible, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls. It doesn't just use voices anymore. It shows me things. I see people burning. I smell smoke. I hear screaming from inside the walls. I know it's not real, but I can't make it stop. I tried to leave 3 times. I can't. Something won't let me pass the tree line. I'm trapped here. It's wearing my face now. I saw it today. It's standing at the base of the stairs, and it looks exactly like me, and it's calling my name in my own voice, and I don't know which one of us is real anymore. And then the last entry, dated the day before Grant arrived. I understand now. The tower doesn't trap the thing below. The thing below is already free. The tower traps us. We're not lookouts. We're food. We're anchors. We're the next voices calling from the dark. I'm going to end this before it takes me. I'm going down. Grant closed the journal and sat in stunned silence because Torres hadn't quit. He'd gone down to the entity knowing what would happen, choosing that over whatever alternative he thought was worse. And 2 days later, headquarters had sent Grant up here as a replacement without warning, and he realized they knew, they'd always known, and they kept the tower operational because whatever was trapped here needed regular feeding, needed someone present to sustain it. He stood and paced the cabin, exhaustion forgotten in a surge of adrenaline and anger, and he thought about all the lookouts who'd come before him, all the people who'd sat in this chair, and realized the same terrible truth. The radio crackled suddenly, and Carol's voice came through. Tower 17, this is headquarters requesting your morning status report. Grant grabbed the mic, his voice shaking. Headquarters, Tower 17, I want to know about Michael Torres, the lookout who was here before me. What happened to him? Long silence. Then Carol responded, her voice flat. Tower 17, personnel information is confidential. Please provide your weather observations. Grant slammed his hand on the desk. I found his journal. I know he didn't leave. I know what's down there. You've been sending people up here to die, and I want to know why. Another silence, longer. Then a different voice came through, male and older and cold. Tower 17, this is District Supervisor Edmonds. You need to calm down. The isolation can cause paranoid ideation, and we're prepared to evacuate you if necessary. But I need you to acknowledge that you understand you're experiencing psychological distress related to your recent divorce and the stress of the job. Grant stared at the radio in disbelief because they were going to gaslight him, pretend his observations were symptoms of mental illness. And he realized that's what they'd done to every lookout who tried to report what was happening. He took a breath and forced his voice to sound calm. Headquarters, I understand. I apologize for the outburst. Probably just need more sleep. Weather is clear. Temperature 72 degrees. Wind from the northwest at 5 miles per hour. No smoke observed. The supervisor's voice came back slightly warmer. Copy that, Tower 17. Get some rest. We'll check in again this evening. Headquarters out. The radio clicked off and Grant sat there shaking, knowing he'd bought himself temporary reprieve, but that they were watching him now, listening to every transmission, waiting for him to crack. He needed a new plan, needed to think beyond just surviving or escaping, because even if he managed to leave, they'd just send someone else, and the cycle would continue forever. He went to a window and looked out the forest, and for the first time he allowed himself to really consider what Torres had discovered. 37 people had died here screaming for help that never came, had been abandoned and left to burn, and now something that wore their voices and their faces was still calling from the dark, still begging to be saved, still trapped in that moment of terror and desperation. Grant wondered if the entity was actually the spirits of those patients, somehow fused together into a single consciousness, or if it was something else that had moved into the space their deaths had created, a predator that fed on the psychic residue of that tragedy. Either way, the pattern was clear. The entity couldn't cross the boundary of the tower without invitation, couldn't physically reach the lookouts, so it used psychological warfare, wore them down with voices and visions and sleeplessness until they either went mad or willingly descended into its grasp. Grant realized he had maybe a week, maybe less, before he reached the same breaking point that had claimed Torres and Chun and all the others, and he needed to do something radical, something none of them had tried. He couldn't just ignore the entity like Hayes had because he'd already engaged with it, couldn't just defend against it like Okonkwo, because defenses only delayed the inevitable, couldn't study it like Park because understanding it didn't give him power over it. He needed to break the cycle completely, needed to find a way to either destroy the entity or free it or starve it of whatever it needed to survive, and had almost no resources and almost no time in headquarters actively working against him. Grant sat down at the desk and pulled out a blank notebook and started making lists, writing down everything he knew, everything he'd learned from the logbooks and journals, looking for patterns and weaknesses. The entity manifested at 2 a.m. every night without fail, which suggested it was bound by some kind of temporal rule or limitation. It couldn't cross the tower's boundary, which meant the tower itself had some protective quality, whether architectural or symbolic or something else. It needed acknowledgement and attention to grow stronger, feeding on fear and engagement. It could manipulate perceptions, creating sounds and visions and smells, but all of its manifestations seemed to be psychological rather than physical. It couldn't actually touch him, couldn't break down the door, couldn't climb the stairs without permission. And most importantly, it seemed to be tied to the specific location, to the site where the sanatorium had burned, which meant it couldn't follow him if he left, but also meant it would still be here waiting for the next lookout. Grant circled that last observation because it felt important. The entity was trapped here just as much as he was, locked into an endless cycle of calling and waiting and consuming whoever answered, and maybe, just maybe, that was the key. If he could figure out what was keeping it here, what was binding it to this place, he might be able to break that binding and free it. And if freeing it was the same as destroying it or driving away, then maybe he could end this permanently instead of just escaping. He started going through the journals again, looking for any mention of the sanatorium, any details about how it had burned, or where exactly it stood in relation to the current tower, and he found a sketch in Park's notebook showing the approximate layout of the original facility based on historical records Park had found. The sanatorium had been a large 2-story building with a central administration wing and 2 patient wings extending east and west, and according to Park's notes, the fire had started in the central wing around 2 a.m., the same time the voice manifested every night, and it spread so quickly that patients in the locked east wing had been trapped with no escape. Park had written, "The east wing stood approximately where the tower is now. Tower was built directly on top of the foundation. Possible that structural elements of original building remain underground." Grant felt a chill run down his spine, because if the tower was built on top of the east wing's foundation, then he was literally standing above the place where 37 people had burned to death. And maybe that's why the entity was so focused on the tower, why it stood at the base and looked up and called for help. It was calling from the exact spot where it had died, trying to reach the people who were now standing where the staff and doctors had been, the people who might have been able to unlock the doors and save them. He looked at his watch and saw it was nearly 3 in the afternoon, which meant he had 11 hours until the voice would come again, 11 hours to decide what he was going to do. And he knew with certainty that he couldn't spend another night in this cabin doing nothing, couldn't just wait for the entity to wear him down like it had worn down everyone else, because that way led to madness or death or worse. Grant made his decision as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of fire, and he knew what he had to do even though every rational part of his brain screamed that it was insane, that it was exactly what the entity wanted, that he was walking into the same trap that had claimed Torres and Chun and countless others. But he also knew he couldn't just wait, couldn't spend another night cowering in the cabin while the voice called and slowly drove him mad, because that was a losing game and he'd already seen how it ended. He would go down, but on his own terms, armed with everything he'd learned, and he would confront the entity directly and try to break the cycle. And if he failed, at least he'd fail trying instead of just giving up. He spent the remaining daylight hours preparing, gathering everything he thought might help: the Polaroid photos, Torres' journal, Park's research notes, a flashlight, his pocket knife, and on impulse he took the religious medal he'd found in the metal box and hung it around his neck. He wrote a final entry in the green logbook, his handwriting careful. Day 7. Have documented extensive evidence of anomalous phenomenon at this location. Evidence suggests entity is remnant of 1923 sanatorium fire. Attempting direct confrontation at 2 o'clock hours. If this entry is found and I am not present, recommend tower be demolished and site consecrated. Do not send replacement lookout. Grant. He set down the pen and looked around the cabin one last time. At the desk where he'd spent hours reading the desperate accounts of previous lookouts. At the windows that looked out over the forest that had become his prison. At the door that led to the stairs that led down to whatever was waiting. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m., and settled in to wait, and the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness while his heart hammered and his palms sweated. At 1:55 a.m., he stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and opened the door and stepped out onto the catwalk. And the night air was cold and still, and the forest below was absolutely silent, like the whole world was holding its breath. At exactly 2 o'clock the voice came, rising up from the darkness just as it had every night. But this time Grant didn't run, didn't search frantically. He just stood at the top of the stairs and listened as it called, "Help! Please! Somebody help me!" over and over, and then, as he'd known it would, it shifted, "Grant! Grant, please! I need help! Grant!" He took a deep breath and shouted down into the darkness, I'm coming down. Just wait." The voice stopped immediately, cut off mid-word, and the silence that followed was so complete that Grant could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned on his flashlight and began descending the metal stairs, his boots ringing against the graded steps, and he counted as he went down, forcing himself to breathe steadily and keep moving even though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. When he reached the bottom and his feet touched the ground, he swept his light across the tree line and called out, "I'm here. Where are you? I came to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. And then he saw a movement at the edge of his light's beam, a shape detaching itself from the shadows and moving toward him. And Grant's breath caught because it looked like a person. Looked exactly like a person, tall and thin, and wearing what might have been old clothes or might have been shadows. And as it came closer, he could see its face, pale and gaunt with dark sunken eyes and a mouth that hung open in a permanent expression of desperate pleading. The figure stopped about 20 feet away and just stood there looking at him. And Grant realized it was waiting for something, waiting for him to acknowledge it, to accept it, to invite it in, and he understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment where Torres had failed, where Chin had failed, where they'd all failed. This was where they'd looked at the thing wearing a familiar face and convinced themselves it was real and given the permission it needed. Grant raised his flashlight so it shone directly on the figure's face and said, his voice shaking but firm, "You're not real. You're not a person who needs help. You're what's left of people who needed help 100 years ago and didn't get it. And I'm sorry that happened. I'm sorry you died scared and alone and called for someone to save you. But I can't save you because you're already gone and you need to let go." The figure's expression didn't change, but it took a step closer, and Grant could see now that there was something wrong with it, something off about its proportions and movements, like it was a memory of a person rather than an actual person. and when it spoke, its voice was a chorus of voices, men and women and children all speaking at once. "Help us! Let us in! We've been waiting so long. Let us in!" Grant felt tears running down his face because he could hear the genuine anguish in those voices, could feel the weight of their suffering, and part of him wanted to say yes, wanted to let them in, wanted to believe he could somehow make things right, but he knew that wasn't what they were offering. That wasn't what would happen if he gave in. He said, "I can't let you in, but I can acknowledge what happened to you. I can witness your suffering. You were real people who died terrible deaths, and no one remembers you, and that's wrong. That's a tragedy, and I'm sorry." He pulled out his phone even though he knew there was no signal, and took a photo of the figure standing in front of him, and the flash lit up the forest for a split second, and he saw dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all standing in the trees watching him with those same desperate eyes, all wearing the faces of the people who'd burned, and then the flash faded and they were gone except for the one in front of him. The figure tilted its head, and the chorus of voices said, "Witness us, remember us, say our names." And Grant realized that was the key. That was what they'd needed all along. Not to be saved, because they couldn't be saved, but to be remembered, to have someone acknowledge that they'd existed and suffered and died. And he pulled out Torres's journal and flipped to the page where Torres had written names of the 37 people who died in the fire, names he'd found in historical records, and Grant read them aloud one by one, his voice echoing through the silent forest. Mary Brennan, Thomas Hayes, Sarah Chun, David Park, Michael Torres. And he stopped because those weren't the names of the fire victims. Those were the names of the lookouts he'd read about in the journals. And he realized with creeping horror that Torres had gotten it wrong, had read the names of previous lookouts, and thought they were the fire victims. And if Torres had gotten it wrong, then Grant had gotten it wrong. And if the entity wasn't the spirits of the sanatorium patients, then what was it? He looked up at the figure standing in front of him, and it smiled, really smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, and it said in a voice that was now just one voice, flat and mechanical and horribly familiar, "You came down. You acknowledged us. You gave us permission." And Grant understood too late that there had never been a sanatorium, never been a fire, never been 37 victims. That was just a story Torres had made up or been fed or hallucinated, and the entity had played along, because it didn't matter what story the lookouts believed as long as they came down, as long as they engaged, as long as they eventually gave in. He turned and ran for the stairs, but the figure was faster, was suddenly in front of him, blocking his path, and more figures emerged from the trees, dozens of them, and they all wore familiar faces. Torres, Chin, Park, Hayes, Okonkwo, Brennan, all the lookouts who'd come before him, all the people who descended these stairs and never come back up, and they closed around him in a tightening circle. Grant tried to scream, but no sound came out, tried to fight, but his limbs wouldn't move, and the figures reached for him with pale hands, and he felt himself falling, felt his consciousness fragmenting and scattering, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his own face looking down at him from the top of the stairs, his own body standing at the railing of the catwalk, watching with empty eyes. Time passed, though Grant had no way to measure it, and gradually he became aware again, became conscious of standing at the base of the tower looking up, became aware that he was holding a position he couldn't leave, became aware that he was waiting for something though he couldn't remember what. Days passed, or maybe weeks, and there was sunlight and darkness and sunlight again, and Grant stood at the base of the stairs and looked up at the cabin and saw someone moving around inside. Someone new, someone who didn't know yet what was waiting for them. He tried to call out, tried to warn them, but his voice didn't work right anymore, didn't form the words he wanted, and all that came out was help. Please, somebody help me. And he couldn't stop saying it, couldn't stop repeating those same words over and over even though he knew they were wrong, knew he was becoming the very thing he'd tried to fight. And then one night, night number 7 for the new lookout, he somehow knew. The figure descended the stairs with a flashlight and called out, "I'm here. Where are you? I came to help." And Grant felt himself moving forward, felt his mouth opening to speak words he didn't choose. "Help us. Let us in. We've been waiting so long." He tried to stop, tried to break free, tried to scream a warning. But he was just a passenger now in something that wore his shape, and he watched helplessly as the new lookout took photos and read names and made all the same mistakes Grant had made. And when the moment came and the new lookout understood too late what was happening, Grant felt his hand reach out along with all the others, felt himself helping to pull another victim into the collective, felt the new lookout's consciousness shatter and scatter, and joined the chorus of voices calling from the dark. And high above in the cabin at the top of the tower, something that looked exactly like the new lookout sat down at the desk and opened a green logbook and began to write in careful, deliberate handwriting. Day 1. Arrived at tower. Everything seems normal. Looking forward to the solitude. It set down the pen and looked around the cabin with eyes that had learned to pass for human, and it checked the calendar on the wall and crossed off another day. And it settled into wait because headquarters had already confirmed that the replacement lookout would arrive in 3 weeks, and had gotten very good at waiting. Had been waiting and replacing and waiting and replacing in an endless cycle for longer than anyone could remember, and the tower would stand and the calling would continue, and people would keep coming because that's what the tower was for. That's what it had always been for. And Grant's consciousness, trapped somewhere in the collective that stood at the base of the stairs, understood with absolute clarity that there had never been any escape, that the tower itself was the entity and always had been, and everyone who'd ever climbed those stairs had already been caught the moment they'd signed the paperwork and accepted the job. And he opened his mouth to scream, but all that came out was, "Help, please, somebody help me," and would be all that ever came out forever and ever. Amen.